Okay, what we're going to do in this example is create a little ZIO HTTP plus MySQL application. And to do this, there are a bunch of different Scala database libraries I could use, but I'm just using something called Scalake or Scalake JDBC, and that's because it's really simple to use, and the setup and configuration will be really similar to what you'll do with other database libraries, so I didn't want to get caught up on that too much. Now, before we get into code, I want to look at the configuration here. So the build.sbt file looks very similar to previous ones. This one's named ZIO HTTP MySQL right there. And then we have the dependencies or ZIO HTTP, the Scalake JDBC library, the MySQL connector, and then I'm doing some logging. I'm controlling the logging a little bit, but anyway, we are using logging, and then I have a little bit of control of the logging that I'm doing as well. I'm running MySQL with MAMP, M-A-M-P, like that. And then I have a ZIO HTTP database inside of that server. And then there's a users table inside of that database. And I just have these two users in it right there. So when we go back over to the code, you can see that we have the ZIO HTTP database right there, root and root. And then in our queries later, you'll see the users table right there. The other thing I wanted to note was what the schema looks like, and you can see that here as well. So we have an ID as an int, name, email, and then created at. So I used, I believe, this one up here to create the table, and then this one down here to insert a couple of test values. Okay, that's configuration. Then we also have the log back that I mentioned over here, little log back configuration. And I just created this to clean up the output just a little bit more than the default would have. And then I just have one file here, and that's this main file right here. But what I did in this main file was I created different packages for the different areas of our code. So when you see each different package, like this one right here, and then this one right here, each of these could be different files in different directories. That's the way you would normally do this, but I just didn't want to really have to deal with that or get into that for this little application. So think of this as being in a config directory. Think of this as being in a model directory, a repository directory, a service directory, an API directory, and then this would be our main application down here, our main ZIO application. So we come back up here. The first one here is the configuration package. And all I'm doing here is I'm creating a database config object with an init function. This attempts to connect to the MySQL database with these parameters that I already showed right there. So that's the init function inside a database config. We'll come back to that in just a moment. Then we have the model, and it's a very simple model. Case class user has ID, which is long, and name, which is a string, and that matches what we have over here. And actually, I see at some point I added an email over here, and I did not add it over here, so I will leave that one as an exercise for the reader, is to add the email here. Next up, we have a repository package, and you might think of this as just being a database package. Wherever you see the word repository, you could just think database. So here we have a trait or interface for our user database, and we only define one function called getAllUsers, and that's a ZIO task wrapped around a list of users. So again, a task is an alias for this longer signature right here, and it only means that any old environment will do. Our code could throw an exception, and then the A parameter is, in this case, this list of user that we have right here. So again, it can take any environment, it'll return an exception value if it fails, and then when it succeeds, it'll return a list of user. That's the interface. Then one implementation of that is UserRepository Live extends that. So we have our getAllUsers implementation. And what I'm doing here is adding some logging, and I've shown this in other videos, so I'm doing a log info right there. Then we have the and then operator, so do the logging and then attempt to read the database. So this part right here is the Scalake JDBC or Scalake JDBC syntax, and it basically means that I want to access the database in read-only mode and then perform the SQL queries. So I just want to select ID and name from the users table down here. And of course that will return all of the users. And you can see that we just take the ID parameter and the name parameter right there, this one as a long, this one as a string, and that's how we construct our users. We convert that to a list. So this part that's highlighted in blue is just the Scala-like syntax right there. And then the tap here at the end lets me do logging. So at this point, I've completed the query, and now I know who the users are, so I can log the query information, and I'm just logging a user count right there is what I was doing. So that's why I use tap after that right there to do that logging information. Next up, we have a user repository object. So this is a companion object that goes along with this information right there. And the reason for this is to create our Z layer for this. So you can see in here we have ZLayer.succeed, and we're saying inside of here we want to create a new user repository live, which is this class right here. So when we go down to the bottom of the code right here, and now you can see the user repository layer, and that is referring to this user repository layer value right there. And this layer is what creates that new user repository live instance. Okay, so that's the repository or database right there. And let me just hide the left side over here. We really don't need to see all that information. Okay, next up we have our service package, or what would be a service directory. And we start again with an interface for the user service. And we define a getAllUsers function that returns a task of a list and user, and that's actually the same signature as what we have up there. And then our user service live is going to take in a repository instance, but you can see that user service live is an implementation of the user service, so that means we have to have a getAllUsers function, and that's going to return that task of list of user. And in this case, all it has to do is call the getAllUsers function on the user repository instance that it's given right there. Then we also have a companion object for user service right here. And just like before, I called that a layer. And then in this case, I used a different constructor. I think I was just fooling around at the time to show different constructors or different ways you create Z layers. But this one is called from function. And then I create a new user service live right there. And when we come down to the bottom, you see the user service layer there. So as I've shown in previous videos, we're providing these Z layers to our application. And then if we scroll back up, that was the service, and now we want to come back to the API. So this is where we create our ZIO HTTP routes. And let's see, what am I doing here? I have the object for user routes, and I define a routes function. This one takes in the user service as a parameter, and it's going to return the usual routes information here. So as you've seen in previous videos, you can have many routes defined inside this area right here. And in this case, I'm just defining one route, so I included the code here, but I have a note here, and I said as an exercise for the reader, break this out into a separate variable value. And then another exercise would be to add, of course, more capabilities to this, additional routes to this. But again, because I just have one route, I included all that code right inside of here. So this is a usual ZIO HTTP route. We have a GET request on /users, and then we have a handler, so we take the request. And now what we're doing is, because this is more of a real world application, is again, we're passing in the user service right here. And now we're saying on that user service, call the function getAllUsers. And of course, inside that service function, that's where the database call is made. So if we scroll up to here, getAllUsers, that has the repository. So it says call getAllUsers there. And that's where this getAllUsers function is run. It gets the information from the database, from that SQL query right there. And that's where we are right there. So then we take this information, and in this case, I'm using fold ZIO. And I have a note here that I'm only using fold ZIO because I wanted to add some logging. I want to show how to use logging in this application as well. So if you don't want logging, you could remove all the ZIO.succeed calls and the ZIO log info call, and then change fold ZIO to fold. But of course, in a real world application, you are going to want logging. So that's why I went ahead and created it this way. Okay, so if we have an error, we want to log, why am I logging application started right there? Because I copied and pasted that. Okay, so that's supposed to be log error. And then our message is going to be, actually what you'd want to do in the real world is probably write more information about the failure, but I'm just going to say error getting users from the database, something like that right there. So I'll save that. And then we have the response, which is correct. So response is the internal server error. That is the type of error that I would want to show, or the type of status that I'd want to show. I return that inside of status. But what's going on here, and the reason you need ZIO.succeed here, I mentioned this in previous videos, is because we're working with ZIO.succeed values here and here. We also need to return ZIO.succeed from this area as well, just to get all the types to line up. So what I mean by that is I specifically cannot return just a response right here. If I try to do that, I'll get a compiler error. So we just wrap that in ZIO.succeed to get this type to match up with that type and this type right here. And actually, I might reverse what I just said and say that the reason I'm using ZIO succeed here is because I'm using ZIO log error first, and then I'm using the and then operator right there. So if I indent that, that would be a little bit more obvious there. But to reverse what I said earlier, because I'm using ZIO here, I need to use it here. And because I use ZIO succeed here, then I have to use it in this situation here and this situation here. And again, if I wasn't using logging, I wouldn't have to do that. So in the error case, that's what we're going to do right there. And that's that code from here to here. And then in the success case, there are a couple of things we could have. The first one is that the database didn't have any users in it down here. And in my case, I do have Alvin and Betty in there. So we won't see that when we call. But when we have no users in the database, when we have an empty list, then we'll return status.noContent. Otherwise here, what I'm doing is just returning a text response. And I'm saying for every user, I want to transform that user into this string right there. Or more accurately, I want to transform each user into that string right there. And then when I'm done with that, I'm working with a list of users at this point. So then I want to transform that list of users into multiple lines. So in this case, I should have one line for Al followed by a line for Betty, or excuse me, Alvin followed by Betty. So that's what's going on in that code right there. And again, this is the one and only route that we have in our user routes in our API directory, or in this case, an API package right there. And now here at the bottom, we have our typical ZIO application. So again, we have an object, some name, extend ZIO app default. Here I'm calling the server program instead of just server. Then we have a for expression. And for some reason, I was using Scala 2 syntax. That was an unusual thing for me right there. But what we have right here is I start off log info, application has started. Then we call that database config init. So that is this code right up here. We're connecting to the database using a connection pool, a singleton right there, to connect to our database and our ZIO HTTP database right there. And then after the database configuration, we create our user service instance from the layer right there. And then we do a server.serve on our routes. So the last couple of lines here, and then this code right in this area here you've seen before. The only thing that's really new is that I'm doing the database configuration work right there. So let's go ahead and save that, scoot this over to the side. And now let's start running our application over here and get that set up there. And now we just say run. And now we have our application up and running. And MAMP is already working because I know I was just accessing the database. And now our server is running, so we can come down here and run a curl command against our route. So this is going to be the URI that we're going to be accessing right there. All right, so that's running on port 8080. So when I access that, we see the logging information up here. Get all users was called. So when I scroll up here, you're seeing that's actually getting called in our user repository live, get all users function. So that's a logging message right before we make our database call. And then we have the second message here, get all users query completed and the user count equals 2. And that's get all users query completed, user count equals 2 right there. So that's the logging messages over there. And then the response we get back from the server, of course, is all this information right here. So we got the 200 OK response. I want to note that we have text/plain right here. That's because we're using response.text right there. And then the database information, or the data, is just those last two lines right there. So that is our ZIO HTTP plus MySQL application. Let me just look back over here and see if there's anything else I wanted to cover. So that was the URL and a little bit of logging. So I think I covered everything. We had the database configuration. We had the model. Again, I'd leave this as an exercise for the reader. You can add the email there if you want, and then start editing the application to add the email wherever we need it. Here's the repository or our database code, and I covered all of that. Then we have our service code, and notice again that we had a Z layer here for the repository. We had another Z layer for the user service right there. Then our API was our ZIO HTTP code. And you've seen pretty much all of this before. The only thing we really added as we got more into the real world is that we're passing the user service in here. And then inside of our handler code over here, we're using that user service to get all the users. And then the user service is using the database code. So even though I put all this code in one file, it actually is getting us much, much closer to the real world because of the separation of all these packages and the separation of concerns into repositories and database configuration and so on right there. So we have the routes right there, and then we have the final application. And I've talked about this type of code several times before, so I won't cover that anymore. So in summary, if you wanted to see a ZIO HTTP plus MySQL or any type of database application, and you also wanted to see a little bit of logging, and you wanted to see some repository code and some service code and some separate API code, I hope all of this has been helpful.